Greetings, people. Let's have a look at this section called animal shelter or animal protection. There are a few things that I want me and you to focus on when we look at this section. One, when we look at animal shelter, the first thing that we will check the importance of having a shelter. Why we must make sure that we provide animals with shelter. That is the first thing that we will check. We'll move on and define the term homeothermic, which they sometimes call it endothermic or warm-blooded. We will check it. What do we call those animals? Then we will look at about 5 different ways in which an animal can lose heat. And when we focus on these 5 different ways when an animal loses heat, I want you to master the definition and also master the diagram, because you may be given a diagram there or else a picture. Then you will be asked, what is this way of losing heat? We will move on and look at different structures whereby we must be able to describe different intensive production systems like a backyard. A backyard. We will also look at semi-intensive, which are 2. We'll also look at intensive. But when we check at this one, we'll look at the different housing systems that we use. I will focus on poultry only in this presentation that I will make. Then we have to explain the basic requirements for a shelter, especially a shelter for what? For poultry. That's what we will check. Let's start from the beginning and look at the importance of shelter. We say we need shelter to reduce the effects of extreme environmental condition. It's whether we want to protect our animals from cold or we want to protect our animals from high heat. So we say the aim or the importance of us building a shelter for our animals, we want to reduce the effects of extreme environmental conditions. Because once the temperature is very low, you will find that the animals will not produce the optimum production, even if it is high. So what we can do, we must provide them with what? With shelter. Then let us define the term homeothermic. We say homeothermic are animals with a constant body temperature that is likely higher than the environmental temperature. I want you to master the last part. Animals with a constant body temperature, the last part which is key. That temperature is likely higher than the environmental temperature. Or sometimes they will just say homeothermic are animals that are able to maintain their body temperature. Sometimes they can put that. These are animals that are able to maintain their body temperature. But I decided to come up with this definition because it will assist you, especially in section A. Let's look at the ways in which an animal can lose heat. One, we have evaporation. In evaporation, we say evaporation, the loss of heat when sweat dries on the skin. When the sweat dries on the skin of the animal, we say that will be what? Our evaporation. Then we have this most important one, heat radiation. Loss of heat that radiates a body into colder surrounding atmosphere. Let's understand this one. We are saying this will be the loss of heat that will radiate from the animal. And when it radiates from the animal, it will go to the colder surroundings. So what you have here, you have an animal. When the sweat or when the heat evaporates, it will evaporate this way, or it will radiate this way to the colder surroundings. So that is the key part on this one. But then when you continue, you get what? Conduction. I like this one. Is the loss of heat when an animal's body is in contact with a colder surface. The colder surface, it could be a wet soil or just a bedding. Take note of this part. We are saying the animal is in contact with what? With a colder surface. What you may get here, you may get an animal. The animal is in contact with a cold surface. Then the heat will evaporate or will be lost downwards. Once you see a diagram like this one, then it means it's what? It's conduction. But if the heat radiates upwards, going upwards, it means it's what? It's heat radiation. Let's check the last two. Convection. Convection is simple. We just say it is the upward movement of warm air and the downward movement of what? Of colder air. The upward movement of warm air and the downward movement of what? Of cold air. Then we have the last one. Excretion. The loss of heat when urine and feces leave the body. The loss of heat when urine and feces leave the body. So what you find here, you find that there's an animal, you find that there's an animal and then the animal is excreting. The animal is excreting. So whether it excretes maybe the manure. So we say that in that way there is a loss of heat. And what do we call that way in which an animal loses the heat? It's convection. So that's how we try to understand this way. Then let's take it to the diagrams. I'll just focus on three: the heat radiation, conduction, and excretion. We said heat radiation, the heat will radiate from the body, moving to the colder surrounding in the atmosphere. So izoti ayiye phezulu. But with conduction, the animal is in contact with the colder surface. Then the heat will move from the animal to the colder surface. Then we have excretion. Excretion is feces or urine. Let's look at these diagrams, my people. This is heat radiation. Do you see the arrows? Then the heat is radiating from the animal to the colder surrounding. Then we have conduction. In conduction, you see that the animal is in contact with the colder surface. Ne? If the animal is in contact with the colder surface, then the heat will move to the colder surface. And we also said here, we also said this colder surface, it could be a wet soil or what? Or a bathing. So they may ask you this question, good, what could be this? What is this colder surface? But the conduction, it is in contact with a colder surface. Then heat I move pants. Then we move to the last one that I want to highlight. Excretion. Excretion, you can see that the animal is excreting something there. So the heat will be lost through what? Through excretion. Or through the removal of what? Of manure. So what you can understand from this, we have 5 of them. We have 5 sine evaporation. The loss of heat when the sweat dries on the skin. Heat radiation. The loss of heat when the heat radiates from the animal to colder surroundings. Conduction. The loss of heat when the animal is in contact with a colder surface. Convection. The upward movement of warm air and the downward movement of cold air. Excretion. The loss of heat when urine or feces leave the body of the animal. Then best we understand that we have checked the picture for heat radiation. We move on to conduction. We move on to excretion. That's how simple it is for you to understand. But then, maybe you can get this diagram, but we have to focus on the other diagrams. Then we have signs to see that this animal has a heat stress. You can have excessive salivation. The production will decrease. There will also be high respiratory rate. There will be open of mouth when breathing, tongue hanging out. We can have loss of appetite. We can have cackling that move away from each other, trying to control their temperature. It can also be restlessness, and then it can also seek shade. Okay, fine. Let's also look. You can rate these ones on your own. Let's also look at how can we manage this one. How can we reduce heat in heat radiation, or even in any of them? One, you can provide shelter. One of the reasons of shelter is to reduce the extreme environmental conditions. So if it's hot, provide shelter or provide shade. Ingakuthola ukuthi kwesisikhathi kuba nesihlahla abakhele ilwane, so that mazidla, then they go under the tree, they try to control their temperature. Breeding of heat adapting animals, you produce animals that are able to adapt high temperature. Then you also use some of mechanical cooling systems. Maybe ubana heater, ubana fan, ubana water sprinklers. We're still gonna talk about some of these. You work calmly with animals. Then you try to rush them. Or else you provide them with what? With water, access to drinking water. So this is what I wanted you and me to check here. What we have checked, if I can summarize everything, we looked at the importance of shelter. So that it is there to reduce the extreme environmental conditions. We look at the definition of homeothermic, which can be called endothermic or warm-blooded animals. We said those are the animals that are able to maintain or to keep their body temperature constant, which would be slightly higher than the environmental temperature. We then look at the 5 ways in which an animal can lose heat. We tried to look at those 5 ways: evaporation, heat radiation, conduction, convection, and excretion. Master the definition and the diagram if it is there. Then now we've just looked at signs of an animal that has a heat stress, and now we've just finished with management practices to reduce the heat stress. That's what we have checked. I hope you master it. Watch the video more than 3 times. Get a pen, write something. Get a pen and a paper, write something, so that you can understand it better.